Hello, everyone. My name is Zuzana Kepplova. I work at SME Daily, which is a newspaper based in Bratislava, Slovakia. And we're going to discuss Disinformation World War, which is a bold title. And I guess we're not going to pretend that disinformation is a new term. And I think from time to time, it's nice to investigate the term a little bit to see whether it works for us, whether it does what it's supposed to do. And let me introduce our wonderful guests, Mr. Tomasz Chłoń, who is an experienced diplomat who worked in Estonia, Slovakia, and Russia. Mr. Chłoń, where are you based now, please?
I'm in Warsaw, happily.
You're in? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. And Mr. Chłoń will be in discussion with Ben Tufft, who works at the strategic communication section of NATO. And I guess he participated on the We Are NATO campaign. And Ben is based in?
Brussels.
In Brussels, wonderful. So let me just open with the first question. Which is why, while the notion of propaganda has been here since ancient times, disinformation is a more recent term. I would like to know when and why did we start using it, and is it useful for you for what you do? Maybe I'll let Mr. Chłoń kick the discussion.
Well, well, it's indeed when I was preparing for this panel, and big thanks to Visegrad Insight, which I admire, for inviting me to this discussion. When I was preparing, I was thinking about the terminology, the notions, and even the title of this panel, of course, which you named Disinformation or Information World War. And is it, I mean, World War, right? Is it truly global? And I double checked, and it is, unfortunately. Perhaps the only continent untouched is Antarctica, but I remain to be corrected. But even, Spitsbergen, of all places, when you think it's just snow, Spitsbergen is less snow and more disinformation nowadays. And I recommend to you this book, very interesting book by Jessica Aro. You may be familiar with this. She describes one of the cases in the book is indeed happening in Spitsbergen, how Norwegian journalists were victims of disinformation from Russian actors. So it is a truly global phenomenon. Let me bring to your attention the fact that, for example, Russia conducts disinformation operations not only, of course, in Europe, in the European Union member states and in partner countries, in the United States, Australia, but also Africa, and maybe surprising or not, that RT, former Russia Today, and Sputnik have 26 million viewers and followers of their accounts in the Hispanic or Spanish language community. So it's truly a global phenomenon, sadly. My second point is it a war? Information global war? And here I would be cautious a little bit, because war is a very handy, headline, makes a good headline, but aren't we giving too much credit to the perpetrators when we speak in such terms as war? Aren't we, playing into the hands of this narrative, or giving into this narrative? Because you know very well, Russia wants us to be afraid, to be scared, to be confused, to live in fear that something is going to happen, right? So when we use the term war, I wonder perhaps we should be a bit more cautious and perhaps find something else, like hostilities, disinformation hostilities. But we should be very clear about who is the perpetrator, and that's something that that perhaps needs to be done more often, to point the finger on who is behind the influence operations where disinformation is one of the key instruments. So in other words, we should not maybe overestimate what this disinformation hostilities is and how dangerous it is, but we should not underestimate it as well. Well, disinformation, as Ben can address the question of what it means in NATO, and I think there is a general agreement both at NATO and in the European Union that disinformation is something that is spread intentionally to deceive and to cause harm. But I think when we talk more broadly, disinformation is a shortcut for much more what's happening in the hybrid world, in what is behind, all the hybrid challenges and threats that we face.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Tufft. I would rephrase slightly my question for you. Why do you think the term propaganda is not satisfactory? Why do we need the term disinformation? And I would pick up on the question of Mr. Chłoń. Do you think it's problematic to call it the disinformation war? Would you agree that it does not serve the purpose correctly?
Well, thank you for your question, and I think sort of taking off from where Tomasz left off, I think what we're facing is a really big problem here. And it's not just disinformation, it's not just propaganda. And to go back to what you said at the beginning in your introductory remarks, I think it's something that's not new. NATO has been facing disinformation or propaganda or whatever you want to call it since its creation, and indeed the issues of disinformation and propaganda and misinformation have been around forever. But what has changed recently has been the scale and sophistication of the kind of attacks that we see, but also the avenues and the channels that are open to both state and non-state actors to disseminate their messages. And I think that is the real issue that organizations such as NATO and the European Union and national governments face these days. I think, sort of to talk about it from a NATO perspective, we see all of these threats under a broader umbrella term, and we call it hostile information activities. And underneath that, we have disinformation, which we term, as Tomasz has already said, as the deliberate intent to undermine or mislead or deceive, to sow discord effectively. Then obviously misinformation is slightly different. It still is, it can be as dangerous. And as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, misinformation, which is spread not intentionally to deceive, but it can still cause massive issues and ultimately can cost lives during a health crisis. And then we also have propaganda, which we've touched on, and also hostile information narratives. And I think the difference between these are our adversaries are always going to say things that we don't like. And there is a distinction, which NATO recognizes, between false information and information that is a matter of opinion or conjecture. And I think that is the big difference. And NATO, along with the European Union, are organizations that are founded on the basis of values, Western liberal values of freedom of speech, of democracy. And that means that we have to be very careful, because there is a very fine dividing line between shutting down legitimate free speech and things that are false and actually demonstrably untrue. So I think that's something that all of us in free societies have to be very careful of, that we walk that fine line between the two. And that's where the issue of regulation comes in as well, which is not an issue for NATO, but it's an issue for national administrations and the European Union. But it's just something to think about. There is a very fine line there. And then to come back to your question about the terminology and terming it a war, I think we do need to be careful about that. I think we need to stay level-headed when we are discussing the problem of disinformation. And whilst we do need robust responses, and indeed NATO and the European Union and a lot of national administrations are investing heavily in this area to counter the threats that we face, I think we should be cautious of calling it a war, because it can spiral somewhat if we use that kind of terminology.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think maybe you will agree or disagree with me. Since Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, we have actually been invited to think about information as a prolongation of a battlefield. And for example, we speak about trolls and elves, which gives us this idea of two Tolkienian armies battling on a battlefield. And I mean, I wonder where did this imagery come from? And are we in a way invited to think of ourselves as kind of soldiers as we write and comment and share links? And Mr. Chłoń, what is your position on this?
Well, we are not living in a fairy tale. Unfortunately, international relations is something different. When I think about who is involved nowadays in this information hostile activities, as Ben termed it, I think that well, most of us are, because of the way we function today, the way we consume news, the internet, social media. So in a way, we are potential and real targets, everybody real targets. And what's happening is a battle for our minds. If, not to convince us to any, propaganda that, the opponents want us to believe, at least to make us confused, to make us doubt our governments, to make us not willing to participate in our democratic processes. So this is the most dangerous thing that we should have in mind when talking about actors on this battlefield. So in a way, we all are, there's a fight to convince us, to what the opponents, mainly Russia, let's be frank, Kremlin, right? Although Chinese are catching up, So this is very dangerous, and there is a lot to be done to confront it. We are not ready yet.
Mm-hmm. We're in a funny way, we're walking around it, and I tend to joke that when in Central Europe, when you say geopolitics, it's a politically correct term for relations with Russia. And Mr. Tufft, do you believe that we're basically just finding nicknames to talk about the relations between the West and Russia? And are we trying to maybe come up with a new terminology in the post-Cold War world? Why can't we just be frank about talking about, we are actually talking about Russia?
Well, I think it may be too simplistic to talk specifically in terms of one country. I mean, obviously, we know that lots of disinformation comes out of certain countries, and we know that there are a range of state and non-state actors that are often turned a blind eye to non-state actors within certain countries. But I think it is a much greater threat than one country. As Tomasz has said, it isn't just Russia. It also is, we have different countries, we have non-state actors. I mean, it is a global problem. And I think we can focus in certain geographical locations. Perhaps there are countries that are more prominent in the area of hybrid threats and specifically disinformation or hostile information activities more broadly. But I do think it's too simplistic to sort of name check one country. I think it's a much bigger problem. And that's why it's a huge challenge, and the response to the threats we face, not only from one country or one government, it's as I say, it's a lot of non-state actors too. It will take years to effectively counter this problem. And that is why at NATO, it is so important for us to build resilience over the long term to disinformation and these kind of hostile information activities. And that is a process that we are conducting with a number of different actors, including the European Union, with civil society, with obviously allied governments, with partner governments, because this is a challenge that cannot be faced alone. It's something that we all have to come together with. The private sector, of course, working very closely with online platforms, with media companies. It really is a whole of society approach to deal effectively with the threats we face from not just one country, but really globally.
Zuzana, if I may jump in, because
Please go.
Well, as a former diplomat, I can be more open than Ben. And I used to think about disinformation in international relations as something separate from what's happening in our societies. So like this internal problem we have with the information environment is separate, but it's not, obviously. And you cannot separate it. When you analyze, when you research, you know very well that the foreign influences, they use our own vulnerabilities. They make use of our own divisions. And we have become also, due to pandemic, quite polarized. Unfortunately, my country is an example of how divided the society is, and in this information environment, we sadly encounter quite a lot of disinformation and attempts to hinder what those who want to fight the threat and the challenge are doing. And quite recent example, I'm now jumping to South America, is what President Bolsonaro did in Brazil, signing a law that actually forbids platforms, Twitter, Google, YouTube, Facebook, to remove content that is harmful, especially nowadays when we have the problem with the pandemic. This is an extreme example, I think. So we have to remember that, sadly, these environments, international and national and domestic, are very connected.
Mr. Chłoń, I would have a question, like specifically tailored to your experience. Could you maybe compare for us the disinformation scene in the Baltic countries and in Central Europe? Do you think these scenes are specifically fit to to specific environments, to the regional identities, to the political problems that are there. Could you please compare it for us?
Well, Russia is very opportunistic let me now take Russia on. It's very opportunistic. So it uses, it analyzes. So they're doing quite a lot of work to analyze the information environment when they conduct their operations, of course. They know our weaknesses, which narratives can play into the minds of our population. So in terms of the Baltic states and Poland, the question of NATO, its credibility, its presence is very much a topic for Russian disinformation. Of course, it's less so in Slovakia, for example. Another aspect is that in Poland, it's not easy to promote pro-Kremlin news, so to say. Yeah. So, and the same is in Georgia, by the way. You cannot be a very openly pro-Kremlin in Georgia because that's not what people like. And the same here. In Russia, in the Baltic states, of course, the situation is different because of the presence of big Russian-speaking minorities, especially in Estonia and in Latvia. So Russia knows very well and does everything to petrify the culture of news consumption in some parts of the Baltic states, like the eastern part of Estonia and in Latvia, where people watch Russian mainstream media, Russian TV, yeah, and that is something that is quite problematic. In Slovakia, in your country, I think the situation again is different than in Poland because you have different history with different history of relations with Russia. You have this, people talk about this pan-Slavic sentiments. Jan Czarnogórski, a wonderful person, suddenly becomes, a politician who promotes, the Russian view of international relations. Yes, so Russians do not need to do certain things they do in Poland and in the Baltic states than in Slovakia in order to be heard, right? And in Hungary, it's even more different because they have access to mainstream media in Hungary. So this is they indeed tailor their activities to local environments.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Tufft, I think you mentioned it at earlier. You talked about the thin line that is between freedom of speech and misinformation, and I came across this popular narrative on disinformation, which goes like this: that Russian or Chinese governments have the right to tell their point of view and to promote it. And it is surprising for me that people don't feel as targets of disinformation, but they rather advocate a kind of freedom of speech for superpowers. So what would be your position on it? Do you think that states or governments are actors of freedom of speech, meaning that they can distort history or lie about their presence in military acts just because they have the right to promote their ideological positions?
Well, I mean, I think you said, should they be able to lie? Definitely not. I mean, lying is falsifying information, so absolutely not. But as you said, there is a very fine line sometimes between an opinion or a perspective on, as you say, a historical event or current geopolitical issues. And I think that is something we have to bear in mind. And freedom of speech is incredibly important, of course. NATO as an organization and all of our member states are democratic, and we are built upon those values. So it's very important to us that we don't cross that line. But of course, it's on a case-by-case basis. So I can't give you a one-size-fits-all policy, because you have to take what the narrative is and look at it in context and assess whether or not it is false or not. But I think the thing I would say is that that means that we need to be much more proactive with getting our narratives out there and building that resilience, as I said earlier. And I think that's why it's so important. I think when we talk about disinformation, often the focus is on immediately responding to pieces of disinformation. And I think there's two problems with that. Firstly, there is so much disinformation, it's almost impossible for us to respond to all of it. We just don't have the resources to do that. And secondly, as most people know by now, actually often that can have the adverse effect of amplifying the piece of disinformation that you were trying to suppress. So I think responding all the time doesn't work, and that's why building resilience in citizens is so important. And that is a medium to long-term aim, but that does mean that when people are confronted with, let's not say a piece of disinformation, but a piece of propaganda, which may be factually accurate, but it has been twisted or slanted in a certain way to be positive to one state or non-state actor's perspective, it means that the person who engages with that and receives that narrative can look at it critically and think, well, with all of the information that I've received and that I know, am I going to believe this interpretation of events? And I think that is where we're trying to get to. And as I said, that is by no means easy, and it's very difficult to get to that stage. And using programs such as media literacy and just general education on engaging with pieces of information and narratives and stories that you come across on social media. But I think that is the best way of countering disinformation and more broadly hostile information over the longer term.
Mm-hmm. And as disinformation is such a huge term, how do you actually break it into units and work around it? And if you want to, for example, build a campaign around particular topics, what do you do?
Well, I think what's incredibly interesting is, as we've already touched upon, is you talked about the vulnerabilities of audiences, and I think that's incredibly important, and it's very distinct depending on what country you're in, what region you're in, what ethnicity you are, what religion you are, what language you speak. And disinformation actors obviously exploit certain vulnerabilities within populations and certain cleavages and certain hostilities between people for whatever reason, or historical animosities. And we need to understand those, and we need to focus on the vulnerabilities and explain, really target our information based on those. I mean, there's no point in having a one-size-fits-all policy, because across an alliance of almost 1 billion people, that is clearly not going to work. There are a whole range of different perspectives. So, for example, at NATO, we do an awful lot of audience insight work. So we do annual polling across the alliance. We conduct focus groups. We work with think tanks, NGOs, academia, to really drill down into what people are saying and thinking about NATO in particular, and their certain biases or perspectives on the alliance and the Western family in general. And using that information, we can more adequately target our communications to hopefully seek to overcome the vulnerabilities and build resilience in certain audience groups. But of course, we can't do this alone. As I said, it is really a whole of society approach, and we hope to provide the baselines and the building blocks for that, and we support allied governments and civil society, educational establishments to do that. And that really is our role, I think, in building resilience to counter disinformation over the long term.